Hi everybody, a very happy new year to every one of you. You may have remembered me saying on the last video that Cape Town was experiencing a little bit of a heat wave. Well, that's not the case today. First day of 2022 and it's raining outside. We all woke up this morning to find grey skies. But that doesn't matter. We don't mind a bit. It's cooling the place down nicely, and so we are very grateful for that. Well, we are yet to look at some more questions and answers, and without any further ado, I think we'll get on with that. Just bear in mind, though, that no one man is the fountain of all wisdom and knowledge, and I certainly am not. I speak mostly from my own experience, and I have reasons for the things that I say. Even though here and there I gather maybe I might ruffle a few feathers. But nonetheless, please indulge me if you can. Your interest is much appreciated. So let's make a start, shall we? Here's an interesting question to start with. What was the attitude to drugs, particularly cannabis, in Rhodesian society and the military? Well, in Rhodesia, we called cannabis dacha. And we had a saying that where there is dacha, there is a knife. So we drew some sort of association between dacha and irrational behavior that could lead to violent criminal acts. And on one occasion during the Bush War, we were sitting in our platoon base. Things were quiet. Men had been called back from patrol. There were no follow-ups going on. And the fellows were sitting around in little groups, talking, sipping away at their beers, and just generally relaxing. And of course telling war stories. But somehow in the process, the conversation went round to drugs. And the very thing that I have just been talking about dacha leading to fights, came up. And our pookie driver, a marvelous man, hugely popular, a great fellow, he had a sort of persona about him, you know. He was like Mr. Cool, super cool. He was streetwise. You got the idea that he had a world of experience that he had lived. And he was sitting there listening to this, puffing away at a cigarette, and then suddenly all conversation stopped because he put his hand under his armpit and winced like this. So, well, we didn't know that he had hurt himself or that he was sick, so we wondered what that was about. And he repeated it, and he said, "Yeah, guys, I can vouch for the fact that dacha can lead to a lot of trouble." He said, "Look at me. My wife stabbed me in the side because I wouldn't share my dacha with her." Huh? We looked at each other. We were quite shocked. Was he making a joke? Did this really happen? And, before we could do anything, he stomped out his cigarette and stood up, turned his back on us, and walked off, still rubbing his side. But I strongly suspect that he had a smile from ear to ear that we couldn't see. I don't believe it for 1 minute. But the point is that it sufficiently shocked us into silence. Yeah, no, we didn't like anything to do with drugs in Rhodesian society. I think that the bulk of the people felt that quite strongly. You must bear in mind that, and I've said this before, that a stick in the Rhodesian army usually consisted of 4 men, because that's all the Alouette helicopter could carry. So if you're in the bush, okay, and you're on patrol, and one man has 25% of your firepower, if they all had rifles, 25% of your firepower is walking around with his head in the clouds because he's bombed out of his mind because he's high on dacha. That is a very unsatisfactory situation to have. And I would be very unhappy if I was aware that any of my men were under the influence of drugs while we were in the bush. I didn't see it myself. I never experienced anything like that. I never had to deal with a situation like that. No, as far as I was concerned, the men that I served with, black and white, had no part. They had nothing to do with dacha, and that's good. You've got to be alert. You've got to have situational awareness. You can't walk around with any of your senses impaired if you're fighting a bush war. No, we didn't like it. Next question. I would like to know more about handguns used by Rhodesian forces in the bush war. Well, sir, I'm very sorry to say I don't have an awful lot that I can share with you. Being an infantryman, we were issued with rifles, and those were regarded by the army as being sufficiently adequate to do the job that we were called upon to do. Handguns were something that were carried by the officers. So I don't have an awful lot that I can tell you. I know that when I did my basic training, and that would be way back in the 1960s, the standard issue sidearm at that time was a Webley & Scott 38 revolver. And that was a very good weapon, I thought. Very gentle, very easy to use, and I enjoyed shooting with it. And for the most part, the bullets went where I wanted them to. But then when I went to the 1st Battalion Royal Rhodesia Regiment, I had to do some training on 9mm Browning automatics. Beautifully crafted weapon. Oh man, I can still remember them today. Superb workmanship. Couldn't fault it. We fired them only once on the range, and that was at Tacoma Barracks. I don't know what the problem was, but when I fired that weapon, the recoil was so vicious and so violent that you could barely aim the second shot. I felt at the time that if I had taken SLR and held it in one hand and pulled the trigger, I would have had the same sort of recoil from that. Oh, it was awful. I have thought about it often and wondered, surely Browning didn't produce a weapon like that. It couldn't be the weapon. I think it must have been the ammunition that we were given, but I don't know what they could have given us. It was faulty or what. But no, I didn't like shooting with that at all, and I was glad that I didn't have to, on a second time, go and qualify on the range with it. As far as the bush war is concerned, the standard issue weapon there for officers was a 9mm Star. And this was produced, I think, if my memory serves me right, in Spain by a company called Taurus. I hope I'm right there. I don't think I'm wrong. Very similar, the weapon that the army used, very similar to the civilian version, excepting I think the working parts had been machined with greater clearances. And so if you held this in your hand, it rattled a little bit, but that was to try and eliminate any stoppages in the field from dirt or anything like that. But by all accounts, a very good weapon. I never heard anybody say anything bad about it. Very common, worn by all the officers in the Rhodesian Armed Forces during the war. So I'm sorry, I haven't said very much. There's not much more I can say to expound upon that, excepting perhaps to just mention that on one occasion I was told that a police constable went home to a farm. He had a rifle with him and a 9mm automatic. And he was attacked in his farmhouse physically. I mean, they had entered the building, and it was hand-to-hand stuff in the bedroom between him and a couple of these insurgents. And in the process, he managed to draw his automatic, and he held it against the side of this gook, and fired off quite a few rounds. Bang, 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 and fully expecting this man just to collapse in a pile next to him. Well, it didn't happen. He slowed down a little bit, but it certainly didn't stop him in his tracks. And it was only when the man was pushed away from him that he managed to grab the rifle which was lying on the bed and swung this round in double quick time and managed to put a bullet in the man's chest, and that stopped him dead in his tracks. And the others fled. So a very lucky escape for that man, but he would not have escaped if he had relied on that 9mm automatic. So I think the army was quite quite justified in its view that the battle rifle was still king, definitely. I would like to know how the FAL were made, particularly the furniture of the rifle. Did they carry like today's FALs that were made in America with bipod, or no bipod? Well, certainly they had no bipod. I never saw a bipod on a FAL, although, and I speak under correction here, I have a feeling that in the very early days of the Rhodesian light infantry, they had what was called a heavy-barreled FN, which they used as a support weapon. And I think, I never set eyes on this weapon ever, but I think I heard somewhere that it had a bipod. So with that exception, I would say that none of the FALs that we used were issued with bipods. Certainly not. There may have been attempts on the part of certain individuals to manufacture a bipod for their rifle. I certainly entertained that thought for a while. I made some sketches when I was in Civvy Street, and I thought I would go ahead, knock one up, take it into the bush with me and see how it worked. But I never got that far. There were folk who tried other innovations. I didn't see it during the war, but I heard about it afterwards, that there was some sort of a suppressor made that you could fit to the flash eliminator on the end of the barrel, and when the weapon was fired on auto, it would depress the barrel. So instead of this weapon climbing into the air, as it was wont to do, in fact it did the opposite. I think it actually made the barrel drop when you had it on auto. But I never saw anything like that. As I said, I only heard about that long after the war had finished. Other things that people did in the way of modifications were to try and extend the length of the magazine by welding a piece onto it, fabricating the fittings, and this would allow the magazine to contain 30 rounds instead of 20. I did see that sort of thing, not often and not common, and I think it was only in the hands of one soldier that I saw that. But somebody else told me that it wasn't very successful, that the extra weight of the magazine made it sometimes drop off the weapon by itself. So there must have been some engineering that wasn't done properly, or I don't know, maybe it just wasn't a practical thing to do. As far as the materials used in the manufacture of the weapon, I'm talking about the R1 here, the stock and the butt were made of glass-filled nylon, as far as I know. The butt had a rubber pad on it, which was very nice, which the FN didn't have. It had a brass plate there. And carrying handles were cut off on the FN, and they were never fitted to the R1 by the manufacturer in South Africa. So other than that, I don't know what else I can actually tell you about the FAL, which might answer your question a little bit better than I have attempted to do. How many rounds did you typically carry on patrol for your FAL? On patrol now. Well, I would have 4 magazines in pouches on my webbing, 1 magazine on the rifle, and say 2 magazines in my pack. So what have we got there? We've got 4, 5, 6, 7 times 20 rounds each, 140 rounds. That would be about the maximum that I would carry. If, however, I was doing follow-ups, as I did at a later stage of the war, the last year I spent just doing that, the area that I was in was a very large portion of the Zambezi Valley, extending up onto the escarpment and in amongst the hills around the Bokassa area. Now, my considered opinion was that that was a sort of a corridor for gooks coming into the country and leaving at that time. So it seemed to me from my experience that they were very reluctant to engage us. They were coming into the country, moving into their operational areas, so they didn't want to get into a punch-up with us before they arrived there. And when they were leaving the country, that seemed to be the furthest thing from their mind. For the most part, you know, their training camps in Mozambique were very poor places. There wasn't an abundance of food or anything there. So it was very common for these returning terrorists to carry a lot of loot with them, and captives as well, that they would take back to sort of bolster their manpower numbers. Consequently then, not expecting any long engagements, I would take 80 rounds with me, and I considered that to be an okay number. It meant that I could move over greater distances. It gave me more endurance because it was less weight that I had to carry, and yet it gave me sufficient. I never ran short in a contact. I never thought to myself at any stage, oh, I wish I'd brought more ammo with me. It never got to that. 2, maybe 3 magazines was the maximum I can remember discharging in a contact. So yeah, 80 rounds was what I carried on follow-ups, and maximum 140 when on patrol. Why do you think the Irish IRA revolution is so cheered and venerated, but the Rhodesian UDI in the Bush War was shunned by the West? Well, sir, that's a difficult question to answer. It makes me think back to the days of my childhood. When I was in high school, I was given a book, and oh dear me, it was full of adventures, and I enjoyed it very much. Michael Collins, I think, was the Irish hero, but I didn't pay much attention to the political side of things as much as I suppose I should have. It would have qualified me more fully, I think, to speak on the subject. But, you know, clearly, the Western political leaders were opposed to what we were doing. So there's no way that they were going to cheer on or venerate the things that were going on in Rhodesia. So we'll just leave them out of it. If I may talk about, as it were, the man in the street in the West. Why would they have shunned what was going on in Rhodesia? I think it's just partly to do with our human nature. And I see it in myself as well. I mean, I'll come home at the end of a busy day, flop into a chair, switch on the TV, try and catch up on some news, and images will appear before me of a struggle somewhere, and there's guns going off, and there's bombs being thrown, and there's explosions, and there's crowds running around, and people are shouting, and they're all unhappy. I don't know what's going on. I haven't had the time nor the inclination up until that point to delve into what is going on in that land, and some of them are so far removed that, I'm just unaffected by what happens there. And so I get tired of watching all of this violence, and then I switch channel. And these days it's probably the latest news on COVID, and so I'll switch channel again and find some more conflict going on somewhere in the world. So I'm pretty disinterested by the time I've gone through all the news channels, and I'll switch over to a movie, and I'll sit and watch whatever is left of it until I go to bed later. And I think that's true of many people. I can well imagine folks in other countries in the 60s at the time of UDI, and during the 70s at the height of the Bush War, perhaps switching channels on their TV sets After all, this is in Africa, and what good ever happens in Africa? And this is Central Africa, and what's going on there? There's just whites, looks like they're bashing the blacks, and I don't need to see this. Or turning to another page in the newspaper and finding something more interesting to read, or sitting in a cinema theatre and just watching a newsreel and just waiting for the clip on Rhodesia to pass, and then they can watch something a bit more interesting. I can imagine that sort of thing, and I can imagine that people were not that interested in what was happening there, not unless they had lived there or had relatives living in Rhodesia or had some special interest in what was going on in the country. But I think generally speaking, folk were just basically disinterested. They didn't hold their politicians to account. They didn't say to the Labour Party, we won't vote for you again if you continue doing what you're doing against the Rhodesians. There's nothing like that. And I think that is perhaps a very simplistic explanation, but it's the best I can come up with. I think at the heart of it was just the distance. It was too far away, too removed, had no impact on their lives, and they had other things to do and to get on with, and they didn't bother about Rhodesia. What was your opinion of the Rhodesian Armoured Corps and the Ferrets and Eland cars? Well, if there's something I should be able to speak about with reasonable authority, it ought to be the subject of armoured cars. After all, I did all my basic training at Llewellyn in the early 1960s on staghounds. In fact, we were the very last troop of territorial soldiers to be trained on these vehicles. So, yes, great big lumbering beasts these staghounds were. I think they weighed 12 tons. Up to a 5-man crew. That's a driver, co-driver, radio operator, gunner, and a car commander. 2 large Chevrolet engines propelled this monster. Automatic gearbox, power steering, power brakes. A very, very well engineered machine. 2 .30 Brownings, one mounted coaxially with a 37mm cannon. The other one was positioned for the use of the co-driver at the front of the vehicle. And then in an anti-aircraft role, one could put either a 5.0 or a 3.0 Browning up on the turret. It also had a 2-inch mortar. So it was a formidable machine, no question about it. And while I was with the 1st Battalion Royal Rhodesia Regiment, with their armoured car platoon, which was part of their headquarter company, we would occasionally go out into the bush with these cars on an exercise known as showing the flag. And what this meant was we'd go hurtling along bush tracks, flying full speed into villages, sending people and chickens scattering in every direction, tearing out on the other side of the village with a pack of dogs on our heels barking furiously. And so we would proceed through the countryside from one village to the other, showing the flag. Well, it was quite fun, and a number of stories that I can recollect of those days. But they came to an end, alas, all too soon, with the breakup of the Federation of Rhodesia and Iceland. And as part of the settlement scheme, the armoured cars were destined to go to Malawi. And so we were called together one day, and we were told this sad news that we were to be disbanded, and that the cars, at the insistence of the company commander, were to be thoroughly cleaned up, polished, everything made ready for an inspection, and they would then be sent across to Malawi, and that would be the end of our beloved staghounds. Well, it wasn't with any great enthusiasm that we tackled the task. And in fact, to be perfectly honest with you, we thought that it was our bounden duty to do something to render these things inoperable when they got to Malawi. And so we, without anybody noticing us, took the 3.0 Brownings and upset all the adjustments inside them. So that although in the hands of a reasonably competent armourer they could be put back in working condition, it would be difficult for the average Malawian soldier to get them working again. And for those of you who are familiar with the 3.0 Browning, you'll know that the cartridge headspace is quite an important setting. And when you dismantle the weapon, you've got to count the clicks as you unscrew the barrel. Well, that was the first and the obvious thing that we put out of kilter. Reassembled the guns, and we thought that was fine. But somebody stumbled onto this, and we were all summoned to a special parade. A free parade, if you like, because the time wouldn't count toward our military commitment, and we were compelled to dismantle these weapons and put them back into working condition. And so I understood that the cars would be going to Malawi. As it turned out, they did not. To my surprise, just a couple of evenings ago, I came across a little video on YouTube, and if you are interested in staghound armoured cars, in the Rhodesian context, it might not be a bad idea for you to view it. I don't know the name of the gentleman who posted it, but the title of the movie is Rhodesia Regiment, 1st and 5th Battalions. Very simple. Rhodesia Regiment, 1st and 5th Battalions. And this man has a wonderful collection of photographs that he has posted of his time with the regiment. And amongst these photographs are some quite interesting ones taken in Salisbury at a parade, 1968, I think the caption said at the bottom. And there, many years after the dissolution of the Federation, were these staghounds trundling through the streets of Salisbury. In different livery though, they were no longer a sort of a bottle green. They were now in Rhodesian camouflage. And I found this particularly interesting because I had no idea that after we were disbanded that these cars were recommissioned for service again. The last I had heard, and that must have been after these shots were taken in 68, that one of these cars was positioned, I think it was at Kariba, and the last shots ever fired from a staghound were by an RLI crew who fired some rounds into Zambia. And I have no idea what prompted them to do that or what the reasons were. Perhaps somebody there will be able to cast some clarity on that incident. Some of the cars, I think, were taken to airfields and parked at night on the runways as obstruction in case any foreign power thought it a good idea to land planes there to try and recapture Rhodesia. But that never happened. Most of them I remember seeing standing in school playgrounds and parks, painted in different colors, and kids would play in them. But enough of staghounds. I can hold a pretty decent conversation when it comes to that type of armoured car. But the question was really about the Bush War and the Ferrets and the Elands. I know that during the days of the Federation, there was a unit called the Selous Scouts. It's not the Selous Scouts that we all associate today with that name. It was an armoured car unit. And they came recruiting at one time, looking for men. They had Ferrets, small, much smaller than the Staghound, two-man car. And but the trouble was it was a permanent force unit, the regulars. So I couldn't see my way to joining them in that sense. So I didn't join the Zulu Scouts. The Ferrets were not as old as the Staghounds, but they were getting along a little bit, getting a bit old in the tooth. By that time, the British Army, I think, had already gone over to Saracens and Saladin armoured cars, and the Ferrets were really being phased out everywhere. But the Eland, when it made its appearance, was a far more modern vehicle, much smaller than the Staghound, about half the size. And when I first saw them, and I think this was at Jock Matoko, I'm sure it was there where I saw them, I wondered a little bit because I struggled to understand what role these vehicles would play in a counterinsurgency war. Thinking as an infantryman by that time, and having put my armoured car service behind me, I knew that you couldn't take these things through the bush. Rocks and boulders and obstructions of every description. They were confined to bush tracks and roads. And these were notoriously dangerous places for vehicles because the terrorists placed mines there. And we would have very often vehicles blown up by landmines. It depended a lot on how the mine was boosted, how it was positioned, on all sorts of factors. Sometimes a 4.5 would go over a mine, and I've seen this, and there'd be little more than a great big bang, and the tire would be blown off the rim, and you could sometimes take the rim off, put the spare wheel on, and very carefully drive the vehicle to some place where it could be fixed up properly. On one occasion, I know when I was inside an African store buying some soft drinks, the truck that had brought me there moved forward a few inches and sort of rolled over a landmine with one of the front wheels. And again, it was just a big bang and the vehicle settled down onto the ground. But that wasn't always the case. Sometimes these trucks could be blown right into the air and could be tumbled over. And a great many injuries happened that way to soldiers. In fact, amongst ourselves, we used to say that the landmine was bad, but it wasn't the actual mine itself that caused the injuries. It was the accident caused by the vehicle detonating the mine. And so when I looked at these Eland armoured cars, I wondered how well they could take a landmine. I'm sure that the people inside would be, the crew would be protected well enough. But I knew that to replace a 4.5 truck in those days was something like about $17,000. And these armoured cars looked like they cost a lot more than that. So I did not think that the Rhodesian security forces could afford to lose Elands at the rate that they were losing 4.5 trucks. So I thought to myself that this surely limits the use that one can put these cars to. But I mean, that was just my own impression. We only ever went on one operation with armoured cars, and it was a nighttime scene. We had been marched in during the hours of darkness to a large village. I think there must have been about 5 or 6 call signs, almost the company strength. And the expectation on the part of those who had planned this operation was that the gooks would be on a hill outside the village, and that these armoured cars would be able to shell them while they were up there, and we would engage them. But it didn't work out that way. There was a meeting that night in the village, and the ambush party on our extreme right-hand side became aware of that, and the word was passed down the line: if we hear anything in the dark to our front, we mustn't fire, because it looked like they were rounding up all the children. And sure enough, an hour or so later, I could hear it myself. I could hear this crowd moving through the bush, probably about 200 meters away from us. But we daren't fire, so we just left them. And I think a couple of hundred kids were abducted that night and taken across the border later. But the armoured cars, they pitched up maybe about 4 o'clock in the morning. We could hear them coming down the drag, and they stopped, I don't know, probably close to us somewhere, but I didn't see them. And we waited until about dawn before we got ready to move away and just to sweep through the village. And at that point, I heard the cars start up again and turn around and disappear up the road. So I never laid sight of them, but that was the only time that they were ever in an operation with us. I wish that I could speak more about this unit, the Armoured Car Regiment, but I can't. My knowledge is very limited. I hear that they were a very good unit. They have a high reputation. They were used externally, I believe. They went into Mozambique a couple of times and did good work there. So their reputation is beyond question. And we were very fortunate to have them. Later on, when the security forces acquired tanks, these were the men that manned them, and they came just in time, because at that point Zipra was planning a conventional war, and they were hoping to stream across the frontier between Rhodesia and Zambia, and those tanks would have been absolutely crucial to holding them back. So yes, Rhodesian Armoured Corps. What is my opinion of them? A very high opinion, I would say. We were very fortunate to have them, and I think they did a very good job. A worthy regiment in its own right. Yes, sir, definitely. Well, folks, I think that's about enough for today. Let me just, in closing, say again that I hope that 2022 brings you lots of success, brings you good health, brings you happiness and peace, and brings you all the things that your hearts have ever desired. Thank you again for the interest that you have shown in me and in this channel. It is much appreciated. I hope that by the time that we get to the end of this year, that we will be able to look back on a very, very satisfying 2022. So, my friends, God bless all of you. Keep well, take care, and until we get together again, cheers.